It's a pleasure to have you here to this second event of a Hot of a Press in 2022. Today we will be presenting and discussing the new book by Tom Slater, Shaking Up the Ignorance, Inequality, published by University of California Press. The title is already quite a provocation, I think, and it means somehow, I would say, to shake up people working in urban studies a bit. So not to take things for granted, to be reflexive, as also Loic says in his foreword to the book. And I will shortly present the author and the discussant, and then the format of the Hot of a Press, who already attended, is quite well known. So we will have an approximately 30-40 minutes presentation by the author, and then we will have 10 to 15 minutes by the discussant. Then the author can reply, but we can open up the discussion, and I hope everybody will contribute to the discussion as well. Let me start with Tom Slater. Tom Slater is a professor of urban geography at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, famous for his contributions to the understanding of the process of gentrification, a topic on which he published extensively articles, books, which became reference text. Whoever wants to know something about gentrification, he reads Tom Slater, definitely. There is some sort of biographical entry into the issue of gentrification. I have to say, I have been also once evicted in Milan in a process of gentrification in the 80s. So it's a topic, and I can feel empathically the issue at stake here. And this brought him to become interested in urban and housing questions of justice in multiple contexts. Of course, the UK, but not just the UK, also other parts of the world. And this experience surely contributed to forge him as a critical scholar of broader processes of neoliberalization. I don't know how it would have been if he would live in Vienna, because in Vienna, the processes of gentrification are very different from the process of gentrification in the UK. But definitely the categories and issues around the topic have been investigated. What also makes interesting is the inherent production of ignorance in the issue of neoliberalization, the hiding what's behind the processes. And I think the book contributes to unveil some of the processes behind capitalism and how it unfolds. And the book summarizes somehow 20 years of investigations and thinking about through concepts and empirical work on the themes. And I think it's a very stimulating for us to hear about and discuss about the book today. So Tom, thanks a lot for being with us today. And before giving you the floor, however, just a few words on Stijn Oosterlynck, who is the discussant. Stijn is a professor of urban sociology at the University of Antwerp in Belgium, and he's also the chair of the Antwerp Urban Studies Institute. He has different research interests, which are mainly about place-based forms of whatever kind of sociality, but solidarity, diversity, migration, local social innovation, welfare state restructuring, all the consequences that are coming out of these processes. He's currently involved in several projects, and one of them is a Marie Curie International Training Network, of which I'm also part, in which is about solidarity and diversity, which somehow intersects a bit, but not 100% with the issues addressed in the book. But I think it would be a good mix and a different perspective on the book's topics today, and that's why we choose him as a discussant. And I thank you also very much for being available today. In the chat box, you will find the link to Google Scholar listings of their publications. They published extensively, both. So I don't want to list here all the contributions, but you just can click through and you will see how broad they have been publishing excellent contributions and very influential in urban studies in general. I stop here. I already mentioned about the format. Tom, if you want to take over and share your presentation, it will be okay.
Right, let's just share my screen first. Hopefully this will work. Can you see that? There we go. Yes, good. Okay. Well, thank you, Giri, for that very generous introduction. It's a pleasure to talk to you today about my book. It's an honor to be asked to do it in this hot off the press series. What I'll do is I'll start by providing some brief background as to what led me to write this book. And then I'll focus on one particular chapter to give you a flavor as I suppose my approach that I take in this book. And then I'll finish off with a few thoughts about the direction, maybe some progressive directions that critical urban studies can travel in, which I finish up with in the book. So first of all, the background. All of us, I'm sure, have stories that shape our worldview and lurk behind our scholarship. And my first academic post was at the University of Bristol. And one particular experience when I first arrived there in March 2003 has shaped a lot of my approach to urban scholarship ever since. So I'll share that experience with you. So this was actually my very first day of my very first academic job. I was still unpacking my boxes of books and sort of wondering where was what and who was who. And I had a knock on the door from the head of department. And he told me that they just got a contract from one of the major departments of the UK government to conduct a review of community involvement in urban regeneration policies at a national scale. And as I was unpacking my stuff, he said, well, we'd like you to be part of this team that's doing this review. And so I'd literally just got there and I didn't have anywhere to hide. So I said, okay, I'll do it. So I joined this research team. And the next few months, I sifted through a fairly massive body of evidence. I mean, the brief that I was given was quite vague, so I just read as much as I could about community involvement in urban regeneration policies. And after doing that, I then drafted a report that spelled out some of the consequences of urban regeneration policies, which I saw to be gentrification and displacement in disguise in most of the cases I was reading about. And I also provided evidence that the concerns of communities were routinely ignored or they were silenced by developers and politicians involved in urban regeneration. And then most telling of all, I also found evidence to show that when urban regeneration policies didn't meet their stated goals of economic improvements, communities were then being blamed for the very fact that they were involved. And so I wrote this report and I got a couple of people to read it and they said, okay, send it off, that's fine. And then must have been about a week later, I then had a phone call from the policy official who had commissioned the research project. And he said, so he goes, Tom, I've read your report and it was very interesting, but I can't consider any of your recommendations. And I said, why? And he said, well, they don't sit well with government priorities, was the reply. And he asked me also to take out the negative stuff, especially take out the stuff on gentrification, or they wouldn't publish it. And so I was, so like the first research project that I'd done after my PhD, and this was sort of, I was on the phone. I didn't really know what to say, but I do remember refusing in no uncertain terms, saying I'm not changing this because that would be dishonest. And that was the end of that dialogue. And who knows what happened to whatever I sent to them. But what it was the beginning of was intellectual concerns with the rise of what I call in the book decision-based evidence making, as opposed to evidence-based decision making. And so I moved to the University of Edinburgh 5 years later, 2008, and I continued working on questions of gentrification, urban marginality, territorial stigma, struggles for housing justice, etc. But further research revealed that decision-based evidence making in urban and housing policies wasn't just a one-off, right, from this project that I'd done. It was pretty much everywhere that I looked in any policy analysis, any sort of policy research that I got into. And I felt that this problem of decision-based evidence making required intense critical scrutiny. And so that's what led to shaking up the city. That's really where it began. Now, one of the things I emphasize early on in the book is what I call its double move. So it not only analyzes some of the more urgent problems of inequality in multiple urban contexts, but while doing so, it provides a critical analysis of the concepts, categories, and methods of mainstream urban studies. And when I say mainstream urban studies, what do I mean? Well, in mainstream urban studies, intellectual inquiry is typically, not always, but typically atheoretical. It's guided primarily by the priorities of state managers, of business elites, and the worries of the mass news media. And this means that the structural and institutional conditions generating inequalities tend to go unquestioned and accepted. So in writing this book, I set myself a question. And this is the question I set myself, which guided the writing. How are the mechanisms behind urban inequalities, material deprivation, marginality, and social suffering perpetuated and made invisible by various institutions? So I started to study the techniques and strategies of institutions such as think tanks, philanthropic foundations, funding councils, certain university research centers, government departments. And I wanted to try and uncover how and why certain questions are kept off the urban agenda while others remain firmly on it. So I like to see my book as an attempt to expose the rise and spread of what I call a vested interest urbanism. And it's called Shaking Up the City because I wanted to shake up some of the core categories and questions and methodological moves and discursive tropes that inform scholarly and especially policy debates on cities. Now, throughout the book, I deployed two concepts in order to analyze vested interest urbanism. And I'm just going to talk briefly about both of these concepts because they run all the way through the book. The first one is agnotology. So scholarship has always been concerned with epistemology, the production of knowledge. But we live in a world where so many politicians and their advisors routinely lie. And sometimes they become even more popular the more that they spread misinformation. Exhibit A would, of course, be in the UK, Boris Johnson and those people close to him. So it seems necessary, given this often very depressing political landscape, to shift questions away from what people know about the society in which they live towards questions about what people do not know and why not. And this calls for an analytic focus on the intentional production of ignorance, and that's what agnotology means. The term was coined by the historian of science, Robert Proctor, who investigated the tobacco industry's efforts to manufacture doubt about the health consequences of smoking. Proctor's remarkable body of work showed how ignorance is made and maintained and manipulated by powerful institutions to suit their own agendas. And the tobacco industry went to great lengths to give the impression that the cancer risks of smoking was still an open question, even when the clinical evidence was overwhelming. And actually, the tobacco industry produced research about everything except tobacco hazards to exploit public uncertainty. And the very fact of research being funded allowed the industry to say that it was addressing the problem. Now, there's a couple of books which have taken up the challenge of agnotology in quite brilliant ways, and I was really inspired by these books. The first one on the left there is a blistering critique of the economics profession in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis by Philip Mirowski. And he argues that one of the major ambitions of politicians and economists close to them and journalists and pundits who embrace a neoliberal view of the world is to plant doubt and ignorance among the populace. And he says at one point in his book, think of the documented existence of climate change denial and then simply shift it over to economics. I really recommend, if you want a wonderful read, a real page turner, I recommend that book, Never Let a Serious Crisis Go to Waste. More recently, on the right there, the sociologist Lindsay McGooey has written a beautiful book called The Unknowers, and she used the phrase strategic ignorance in reference to situations where various institutions create or magnify unknowns in an offensive rather than defensive way to generate support for future political initiatives rather than simply to avoid liability for past mistakes. And so I was really inspired by these scholars and what they were doing. And I wondered what I could do by applying agnotology to the study of urban inequality. And so that's what I try and do in Shaking Up the City. But agnotology wasn't enough. I needed another concept to help explain precisely how certain terms and categories become so powerful that alternative or competing terms and the arguments they anchor are kept off the political grid and the policy agenda. Now, critical urban studies has a tendency to shortchange the symbolic, I think. And this is a problem because there is a lot of evidence that symbolic structures don't simply reflect social relations, but help constitute them. So the second concept I use throughout my book is Pierre Bourdieu's symbolic power. And that's helpfully summarized by his former student, Loïc Vacon, as the capacity for consequential categorization. So symbolic power is helpful in tracing how various categories become elevated into consequential discourses emanating from state officials and institutions. So what I try and demonstrate in my book is that the articulation of agnotology with symbolic power allows us to understand the institutional arrangements and the symbolic systems that feed off each other to shape the unequal social relations that we see in cities across so many contexts today. So those are the two concepts that anchor Shaking Up the City. Now, if all of this seems rather abstract, what I'd like to do now is give an example from chapter 4 of the book to bring it all to life. And this chapter is about the epic and increasingly global struggle for rent control in the context of mainstream urbanists warning us that rent control of any form, of any kind, anywhere is a terrible disaster. So I'm going to talk about this chapter and some of the arguments I make, but I'm also going to throw in a few extra things because I'm still trying to keep up with what is quite a fast-moving debate. And there's some interesting things been happening in Berlin, which I'll also mention as well. Maybe some of you listening will know even more about them than I will. So for about a decade now, I've been fascinated and often disturbed by the huge influence of free market think tanks in shaping public policies in the UK. So if a senior politician gives a high-profile speech, it tends to be the case, not always, but it tends to be the case that the ideas have already been aired in a think tank publication not long before. So in the process of tracing this massive influence of these institutions, I've read a lot of their publications, especially on housing. Now, I'll be honest here, this was really tedious work and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. It was very depressing work a lot of the time, but it felt important because what I realized actually that the literature on think tanks is very small. And maybe that's because reading their publications can be pretty nauseating at times. But these institutions are so powerful. And it seemed very, very important to track how they operate, to see the kinds of arguments that they put forward, because they end up being so influential in how people live their lives. And as I read more and more of these documents, I realized that there's various techniques that those working in think tanks use when they're writing these publications. And just to give a couple of examples, there's always like a concoction of a falsely balanced debate in which there should always be two sides to every story, even if there's evidence overwhelming in one particular area. They also tend to pump excess noise into the public discussion because ubiquity helps pave the way for inevitability. And I've written a lot about think tanks in recent years, and it's encouraging to see that there are more scholars who are now writing about think tanks. But the literature is still pretty small, and it seems problematic to me because they're so important. So in Shaking Up the City, I do mention think tanks on a few occasions, but particularly in the chapter 4 that I'm talking about. I've developed also, I suppose, a strange fascination in what really upsets the people working for these think tanks. And I should say that in the UK, at least, the people working for these think tanks tend to be white men with Oxford or Cambridge degrees in economics or politics. It's quite breathtaking. This sort of, it's like a assembly line almost of people who are then dispatched from these departments with degrees into think tanks, where they then shape the policy agenda. When I say the things that really upset them, I'm talking about things that result in what we can only really describe as tantrums. And rent control is very high up the list. In 2015, I got involved in a housing justice movement in Scotland called Living Rent. When I started making some supportive remarks about the necessity and urgency of rent controls, two economists working for the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is one of these free market think tanks, they somehow got hold of what I was saying, and they went completely nuts on me on Twitter. And it was totally fascinating to see what they said. They just would not engage in any kind of debate over the subject of rent control. It became a full-on and quite childish attack on the discipline that I work in geography. It was really, I was trying to engage them to say, well, tell me where I'm wrong. Like, try and explain to me where it is that you disagree with my argument. And it was just these kinds of things about geography that was all they could fire back. And it went, I mean, it got worse. It went, you know, I was called a communist and all these sorts of ridiculous sort of playground insults that that obviously, you know, made them happy. But it was, you know, it was quite fascinating to see that there was just no attempt to engage in any kind of debate. So the Institute of Economic Affairs, by the way, is a pivotal institution in the history of neoliberalism in the UK. It was founded in 1957 by somebody called Anthony Fisher, who was an ex-military pilot, also a wealthy chicken farmer, and he was a personal friend of Friedrich Hayek. And this Institute of Economic Affairs went on to have a massive influence in the rise of Margaret Thatcher, and it informed many of her most significant policies. But in 1972, it published an assault on state intervention in housing markets, and it was entitled Verdict on Rent Control. And it included essays by none other than Hayek himself and numerous other giants of neoclassical economics, including Milton Friedman. Many of the contributors to the pamphlet were actually part of the original Mont Pelerin Society, the birthplace of the neoliberal creed. And in the introduction, the reader is left in no doubt as to the tenor of what follows. And there's what they say in the introduction. Rent control is a solution, in quotes, that exacts a savage price to be paid by future generations. So verdict on rent control was put forward as the definitive verdict, with these giants of economics behind it. As I started reading more and more about rent control, I quickly discovered that it's not just economists on the right, I suppose, who argue against it. In 1965, the Nobel Prize-winning Swedish welfare economist Gunnar Myrdal, he said, rent control has in certain Western countries constituted maybe the worst example of poor planning by governments lacking courage and vision. And in possibly the most famous tirade against rent control of all time, the long-term chair of the Nobel Prize in Economics Committee, Assa Lindbeck, remarked that rent control appears to be the most efficient technique presently known to destroy a city except for bombing. Now, Lindbeck, by the way, was a political liberal. He was by no means your stereotypical right-wing economist. But his words, in multiple international contexts, have repeatedly shut off any useful debate about rent control before it even gets started. And they've led to numerous imitations and even extensions, such as this one. Rent control is worse than bombing. And it's quite amazing how much of this stuff you can find just with a simple Google search, and how many people have used this bombing analogy when talking about rent control. So I mentioned symbolic power earlier. The terms mainstream economists use to condemn rent control are always the strongest possible. And also I should say that many of these economists are very well known and very well read public intellectuals. For example, Paul Krugman, he also has castigated rent control time and time again. But when they condemn rent control, their audiences read them and they listen to them and perhaps they believe them. Now, the strong negative reactions to rent control, by the way, are not purely ideological. I just want to emphasize this. They're driven by the fact that very few economists ever get past the destructive consequences of what are today referred to as first-generation rent controls, a complete long-term freeze on nominal rent significantly below the market level. European countries imposed these during World War I, but they really took off in multiple contexts across the world, not just Europe, after World War II, in order to cope with the massive relocations of labor during that time and to ensure affordable housing for returning military personnel. In European context, housing reconstruction after World War II was slow due to extensive damage and especially war-ravaged economies, so rent controls remained in place, often with very little adjustment from wartime levels of rent. And many governments actually maintained those controls as a facade to hide the lack of an effective housing program. And the consequences for urban housing markets were very damaging. So landlords had chronically insufficient income for expenditure. That led to large-scale physical decay and abandonment. There were serious mismatches between housing units and tenants, and therefore reductions in availability to the point of saturation. And long rent freezes encouraged highly exploitative, residual and illegal markets in housing provision. If you want to know more about this, I just want to recommend and highlight this most brilliant book. If any of you want to see just a stunning study that every time I open this book, I find more insights in it, and I've read it about 3 times now. Sonia Abachi's Paradoxes of Segregation. She painstakingly documented these processes that I've just mentioned from the late 1940s to the mid-1980s in the southern European context of Spain, Italy, Greece, and Portugal. So evidence of the deleterious effects of first-generation rent controls is substantial across many contexts. And when some economists condemn rent controls, and we're talking across the political spectrum here, it's those first-generation rent freezes that they have in mind when they're doing so. And among the left, no scholars that I'm aware of, and certainly no housing justice activists, are calling for them. So these things are gone, right? But whenever rent control is mentioned, it's the first generation rent controls that people want us to think about. However, there's something else, and this is what I go into in Shaking Up the City in chapter 4. Second generation rent controls, considerably different, much more varied, and still remarkably under-researched. What these do is they protect tenants from excessive rent increases by creating a set of conditions for any increases, which are usually related to housing quality, while ensuring that landlords will receive a reasonable return on their investments. And they're so varied, by the way, that it's very hard to generalize about them. And they're so different from their predecessors that I think they should be evaluated independently from them. But this evaluation work is very difficult to do, because you have to disentangle the effects of rent controls from numerous other policies that shape local housing markets, such as the state of the local and macroeconomy, taxation policies, welfare regimes, land values, land ownership, real estate transactions. There's a lot of difficult work to do to evaluate these things. But after reading as much as I could about second generation rent controls, there seemed to be fairly compelling evidence that rent controls of this kind not only make housing more affordable, but restrict evictions, either those that happen through rent increases or those that happen through renovation or conversion. So rent control has now become a crucial battleground in struggles for housing justice in many cities across the globe. I've noticed certainly in the last 5 years, there's more and more movements that are calling for rent control because the cost of rental housing has become so absurd and such a crisis in so many cities. But because of all these campaigns, there are numerous attempts by people who don't want rent controls to derail those movements, telling us what a massive disaster that rent controls are and what they will be. And in reading what those people have to say who are trying to derail these movements for rent control, I've identified 3 myths, or 3 deliberately engineered falsehoods, I think is a way to describe them. And these are that rent controls will threaten the quality, supply, and efficiency of a housing sector anywhere at any time. And I'm just going to deal with these quickly in turn. So the first myth of quality. The quality myth goes as follows. Rent controls would have negative consequences on the overall standard of rental units on the market. And the spectre of first generation rent controls dominates this argument. So if a landlord can't charge a tenant the rent they would like to charge in order to make a profit, then they will have insufficient funds for maintenance and expenditure. But the most obvious flaw with this argument today is that housing quality within the private rented sector is already atrocious. In the UK, it's the absolute worst of all tenures. The most sophisticated surveys of poverty done in the UK show that 1 in 3 tenants in the deregulated private sector live in structurally inadequate housing. Also, in the decades before World War I state intervention in housing, standards were far worse. So the historical record of laissez-faire liberalism on housing standards is simply terrible, especially in Scotland, where I live. Dismal conditions, overcrowding, especially in tenement buildings. So those who are arguing that rent controls of any kind will always and everywhere worsen housing quality, well, they can't have it both ways, because when there has been little or no regulation, rental housing quality has been truly appalling. And so the consequences of steady and long-term deregulation and privatization of various forms of rental housing has actually had very dangerous implications for tenants. And we saw, for example, 5 years ago with the Grenfell Tower fire in London, what happens when deregulation goes too far. So it's misleading to claim that introducing regulation in the form of second-generation rent control would make quality and safety worse. And that's abundantly clear in some European societies. I think the Netherlands is probably the most interesting example, where until recently, the amount a landlord was allowed to increase rent on an annual basis was conditional upon the standard of the property that they are leasing. And the result is a rental housing stock that's certainly in much better shape than in the UK. The second myth is the most dominant one of all, and this concerns the question of supply. Again, via appeals to the experience of first-generation rent controls, the argument goes that if any rent controls were introduced, there would be no incentive for anyone to become a landlord. Existing landlords would just withdraw their properties from the market. This logic actually implies that any curtailing of the profits to be made from a sector will simply stop people investing in it. And if we think about this and think of other things, it becomes absurd. So it's akin to arguing that a minimum wage means companies stop employing people, that sales tax means nobody sells anything, that fuel tax means nobody drives. So it's an argument, this one, that's based on the belief that people will only seek to make money in conditions of totally unhampered profitability, a fantasy of perfectly competitive markets where landlords compete to produce homogeneous housing units, where there are no externalities, where every actor possesses perfect information. But what I will say is that if landlords are told that they can't by law charge a tenant whatever they like without meeting certain conditions, it's highly unlikely they're all suddenly going to sell up and get out of the sector. And there's no robust evidence from anywhere to demonstrate that this happens. I came across a study by someone called Loïc Bonneval, and this was done on 64 buildings under rent control in central Lyon in France. And he found no evidence that the profitability of real estate was affected by rent control over a period of 50 years. So when people have looked at this and seen what's been going on, they found that the opposite is the case. In tight rental markets where developers and landlords have market power, rent controls have actually increased supply. If developers can't generate extra profit through rent increases, this creates strong incentives to build more affordable units on a large scale, or for landlords to subdivide much larger rental units. And there's evidence from cities in the United States that this is happening, particularly New Jersey and from Massachusetts. But let's also consider the opposite end of the supply argument. So if you believe the economists who are saying that rent controls restrict supply, you might assume that if long-term rent controls end, then that would mean that supply will increase dramatically. But in the book that I mentioned earlier, that wonderful book by Sonia Abachi, she's demonstrated that ending first-generation rent controls in cities in Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Greece, it did not open the floodgates for housing supply, as in adequate and affordable housing. By contrast, it facilitated gentrification, displacement, forced evictions of low-income and other vulnerable tenants. So, and also deregulation and corresponding liberalization of the housing market meant that in all the cities that she studied, rents escalated not just in upgraded districts, but in the entire municipal area, outpricing low-income tenants from most municipal districts. So the supply argument is flawed, and it's complicated by empirical research done by people like Sonia Abachi. And also I want to say, just to give a simple illustration of how skewed the entire debate is, those who argue against rent control repeatedly and inaccurately claim that it always drives up rents for other tenants who are unprotected by it. But that argument is always framed against rent control. It's not as an argument, it's not framed as an argument against unregulated landlords. Finally, we come to the efficiency myth. For mainstream economists, something is inefficient if it artificially interferes with the supposedly natural operation of the price mechanism of the market. So rent controls are repeatedly condemned as forms of price fixing that will distort market values and encourage the problem of sitting tenants who will do all these things that I've listed here on this slide. Now, the problem with these appeals to rent controls being inefficient, first, the assumption that low-income households have the freedom to choose where they want to live without any kind of constraints on their lives. And second, the way inefficiency is skewed towards the interests of economist models and ultimately landlords. So if we consider housing as a question of social justice, housing as a human need, then inefficiency arguments become more complicated. There's an interesting book that was published a few years ago by David Madden and the late, great Peter Marcuse. And they pointed out that, and I quote, "One person's inefficiency is another person's home. From the perspective of a tenant facing displacement from their longtime home, it is the system of commodified residential development that is inefficient, not to mention cruel and destructive," end quote. So the language of efficiency actually reflects the different worlds between, I suppose, tenured economists working in elite universities or even in think tanks, and the lives of low-income tenants struggling to feed their families on very low incomes, or even having to make the choice between paying rent or eating, which is increasingly a problem in the UK, by the way. So real efficiency is surely not achieved when rental housing costs have reached around 50% of household incomes, and when households have so little money to spend on other necessities, when the effects of housing security place pressures on other sectors, such as healthcare provision. The case of the UK is actually probably the most inefficient of all, because the state actually hemorrhages £35 billion a year on payments to private sector landlords so that people eligible for social welfare can pay rent. Now, underpinning this three-pronged mythology that I've just outlined, so quality, supply, efficiency, is a long and unending debate on what leads to high housing costs. For neoclassical economists, for conservative think tanks, developers, anyone in some way connected to the housing industry, the high cost of housing is due to a simple imbalance, supply and demand. Too many people, too few homes. In this register, the remedy for the imbalance is equally simple: to remove any barriers that prevent developers building as much housing as possible. So not long ago, the economist Ed Glazer famously used a New York Times op-ed to call for complete deregulation, and that's what he asked for. But this is just misleading, because house prices are not determined by supply and demand, because you do not have a choice about needing to be housed. Allow an unregulated market to develop when social housing is also being cut. It's the example of the UK. And there's no choice not to buy what is on offer other than sleeping on the streets. So prices will go sky high. Certainly in the UK, there's now more housing than ever before per person and per family. It's just shared out much more unequally than ever before. So going back to the question of agnotology, I've heard quite a few people argue that there's no such thing as the intentional production of ignorance, because all that exists are people with different worldviews, different interests, different opinions. People simply argue and defend their beliefs with passion. And I actually gave a presentation a couple of years ago where that was a response from somebody in the audience, and it was an interesting and good response, but I think it's wide of the mark. Why? Because even when there's a vast body of all kinds of evidence that is wildly at odds with what is being stated, and when the social realities of poverty and inequality expose the failures of economic deregulation, the people who are pushing the argument that rent control is a terrible disaster, just to take one example, they just become noisier. They become even more zealous in their relentless mission to inject doubt into the conversation. and ultimately make their audiences believe that government interference in the workings of the free market is a threat to the social fabric. So with this in mind, I just want to finish my discussion of rent control by mentioning what happened in Berlin very recently. So Berlin's rent cap, or Mietendeckel, was part of a new law passed by the city in January 2020. The cap prevented owners of flats built before 2014 charging more than what had been agreed in June 2019. New builds were exempt from this, by the way. It also stipulated that any rents that were 20% in excess of acceptable levels should be reduced, varying according to location and quality. Landlords who did not comply with that new law faced heavy fines. The policy was to be in place for 5 years, following which rent increases would be limited to 1.3% per year in line with inflation. This Mietendeckel was the product of years of organizing by housing movements and left-wing parties in the city. And it was very popular with Berlin's tenants, not surprisingly, who make up 3/4 of the city's households. It meant that hundreds of thousands of households were eligible for a significantly lower rent, and those rents had been skyrocketing in recent years. And it also meant that it was no longer possible for speculators to buy buildings for the sole purpose of rent gouging. But of course, this rent cap was hated by landlords, hated by the real estate investors in the city, and members of Germany's conservative political parties. In March 2021, Bloomberg Opinion, a long-time mouthpiece for the free market approach for housing, it ran a piece by Andreas Kluth with this headline: "Berlin's rent controls are proving to be a disaster." And here's what he said: "As expected, rents in Berlin's regulated market plummeted in relative terms, and rents in the unregulated market simultaneously started rising faster. Real estate loses value if its future cash flows to landlords are capped. There was also an acceleration of apartments going up for sale as landlords tried to cash out of their now less profitable investments." So I read this and I was thinking, well, rent control is doing what economists say it doesn't. It's reducing rents and it's increasing the supply of apartments. So that sounds fantastic, right? But then the conclusion of this article was so predictable. I was waiting for it as I read it. And here's what the conclusion was. So the biggest question is whether this episode of left-wing populism has damaged confidence in Berlin's real estate market permanently. If investors fear that local property rights will be put at risk in every election, they might stop building houses in the city at all. So what you see as the biggest question depends, of course, on where your interests lie. In 1934, the great economist of industrial location, August Losch, he rather pompously stated that if my economic models do not conform to reality, then it is reality that is wrong. And this seems to be exactly the kind of stubbornness to dislodge when we think about who dominates the conversation on rent control. Anyway, a lawsuit against the Mietendeckel was filed by 284 parliamentary members of centre-right parties. This was last year. The much anticipated ruling, pretty much exactly a year ago, Germany's constitutional court ruled that the Mietendeckel was unconstitutional and therefore null and void. So the rent freeze was lifted, increases could then be demanded on existing leases. And so landlords are also entitled to demand back payments, and countless evictions then loomed. So this is still, by the way, an epic tussle, I gather, that's continuing. Activists in Berlin have to chip away at the layers of strategic ignorance on rent control all the time. And they have to navigate this sort of ridiculous and extreme false choice between, I suppose, savage capitalism or old-fashioned socialism. And so there's the difficult set of debates which people have to try and intervene in order to make political progress. So that's chapter 4 of Shaking Up the City, with a bit extra thrown in from Berlin. I see I've exceeded, I think, my time that I have. I was going to talk briefly about the end of the book, but I can do that maybe in the question and answer session. I hope that gives you a flavour, I suppose, of what Shaking Up the City is about and the approach that I adopt. And I'm very interested to hear what Stijn made of it. And I think it's probably best if I hand over to Stijn now, and then I can tell you about the end of the book that I wanted to tell you about maybe when people ask some questions.
Wonderful. Thanks really a lot for this dense and stimulating presentation. Stijn, the floor is yours, and then we can open up the discussion.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to Yuri and the organizers of this book panel at the University of Vienna for inviting me, and of course thank you, Tom, for writing this book. It has been a real pleasure to spend time with it over the past 2 weeks and get immersed in your thinking, and I'm of course very grateful to be given the opportunity to share some of my thoughts on the arguments in the book. Now, I think as most people, I've been familiar with Tom Slater's work for quite some time, especially his trenchant critique on the research on neighborhood effects, and his work very much inspired by Louis Lacan on territorial stigmatization, which remains a very, very relevant topic for everybody studying cities, of course. Now, Tom makes his scholarly position very clear all through the book, but especially in the beginning of the book. I think he works from a very strong commitment to social justice, particularly housing justice. And to that end, he's very much dedicated. And that's, I think, also the spirit of this book, to keep critical urban studies alive and kicking, but also productive for the ongoing social struggles for social justice in the city. And he's not afraid of challenging some of the colleagues who he feels are too much immersed in theoretical debates without much who don't make much of a difference to the actual people living in cities and suffering from its injustices. And so for him in this book, and that's also one point I want to engage with, critical urban studies are making critical urban studies productive for social justice in the city very much means defending the intellectual autonomy of urban scholarship against what he calls vested urban interests that impose their agenda through external research funding. And this funding is mostly state-based, so he's rather skeptical of engagement with policymakers and policy-relevant research. Now, at the outset of this intervention, before I develop some of my comments, I want to sort of make my own position clear. I think I share Tom's position and commitment to social justice in the city. I think that's also a typical feature of much urban studies scholarship. It's a long tradition, which I think we rightly value. But I write from a different context than Tom. I think I am not working. I used to work in a university in the UK, but I'm not working at the moment in a UK-based university. I'm based in a continental welfare state, a welfare state which certainly had its share of neoliberal restructuring, but not as much as in the Anglo-Saxon world. We have universities which are still relatively well-funded, who provide, as I feel it, a reasonable degree of intellectual autonomy, although certainly not without their constraints, and who are still managed, importantly, by academic peers who temporarily manage university, who are not sort of full-blown managers. And so my view on the state, I'll be honest about it, is more benign. Although I certainly do not want to underestimate the symbolic and the material power of the state and the political and economic elites who govern it. And I very much value engagement with policymakers and with policy-relevant research, although that's only a part of what I do, but it's something that I find valuable. Although it's very often difficult and frustrating, and I had very similar experiences of the one Tom is talking about, not just with state, but also with social movements, I must say. Yet on the whole, I find this kind of engagement is meaningful and often, not always, but often productive, a productive venue through which to change society for the better. I'll come back to that later, but I just wanted to make clear that sort of difference of but shared position, but also a difference of position. I want to engage, I want to make 3 broad comments on the book. I will not go into detail into one of the chapters, or maybe just one of them, but I want to kind of engage with agnotology, which Tom calls the intentional production of ignorance. I thought that was a very thought-provoking insight, or a very thought-provoking perspective. I think it was the word ignorance that made me buy the book. I thought I was very kind of triggering thinking and stimulated me to engage with it. Secondly, I want to say something about the engagement with policymakers and policy relevance research. And thirdly, and that's where I engage with one of the chapters in the book, I want to say something about neighborhood effects, and especially from the point of view of local social innovation, which is a kind of body of research I have myself been quite involved in, and who has an explicit neighborhood focus. So I want to kind of challenge a little bit of what Tom is saying about neighborhood effects from that point of view. But let me start with agnotology. it's, as I said, it's the first thing that struck me when I received or when I bought Tom Slater's book. The reference to ignorance in the subtitle is very, very much triggering people to buy the book, I think. No, all of the chapters in the book have been published before, I think, except for the introduction, the conclusion, in one form or another, so they've been thoroughly revised. But it's specifically the notion of agnotology and symbolic power, as Tom explained, which kind of provide meta concepts to develop a broader, more encompassing argument across the different topics that Tom has been engaging in, and which also allow him to make a kind of argument or a kind of a statement on the state of urban studies or critical urban studies today. And I think the book does a very good job in showing how scholarly debates in urban studies, especially when they interact with policymaking, how they are confronted with agnotology, and so the intentional production of ignorance. And I think there's some very, very convincing cases in the book about that. Tommy already explained at length the discussion on rent control, which I think gives a very, very detailed and very useful also for teaching example of how we should be very critical about policy reports of think tanks. But I think that he does the same for resilience quite early in the book. There's also a very good piece on sink estates, in which he explains where that comes from and what kind of work, political work it does. There's some very good example also of false choice urbanism, gentrification as investment, and pitched against disinvestment. So I think these are all very good concepts or very good examples of how the intentional production of ignorance is drawing attention away from socioeconomic structures that produce social injustices. And so here I think the concept and the perspective of agnotology really has added value. It really shows how research findings and explanations are presented in such a way or conceptualized in such a way that they prevent us from understanding what really is at stake in cities. In other cases, though, I'm a bit less convinced. In some cases, I feel that agnotology seems to be just another way of claiming that something is incorrect. I think the defense of rent gap theory, that's where, for me, it shows most clearly that I don't see much agnotology thinking there. I think it's just a kind of attempt to deal rightly or wrongly with all the criticisms that have been leveled at rent gap theory. I think there the author, or Tom, seems to be very much driven by the ambition to prove critics wrong, which is completely legitimate, and I'm completely with him on many of the arguments. But there, the ambition to uncover agnotology moves a bit to the background. So there, the ambition to really show the particular way in which some of the arguments are wrong and how these wrongs are productive of a certain kind of politics intervention moves a little bit to the background. And this leads me to a first set of questions on agnotology. I'm completely agree that there is something like agnotology. So I'm not going to argue that there isn't any intentional production of ignorance. That is certainly the case, especially in this kind of gray zone between think tanks, consultancy agencies, policy relevant research teams and academia. This certainly is the case, but it still begs the question, I think, where does the conventional academic debate and disagreement, which we do all the time, we all the time disagree, where does that conventional academic debate and disagreement fit into your analysis of agnotology? So when are other scholars or other experts, according to you, wrong just out of good faith, with no bad intentions, but just because they have a different perspective, they have a different way of reading the available evidence, and when they are doing it intentionally wrong? So how do you make a difference? I mean, I agree you're opening up a field of analysis, which is interesting, but where exactly do you make the difference between an academic which is just disagreeing with you out of good faith, or somebody who's just have bad intentions and is intentionally producing ignorance? And the examples you gave were good examples of, I think, agnotology, but there are also quite a couple of examples you could think of. Well, is this not just sort of academic disagreement? I mean, you cite a few colleagues on the neighborhood effects debate, Paulson, for example. When is it agnotology, and when is it just a sort of proper academic disagreement? So that would be a first question. I also wondered whether you could discuss a little bit more on agnotology as a future research agenda. And I was expecting in the conclusion to read a little bit more about how you would continue, or how you would hope that others would continue on agnotology as a future research agenda. So what are some of the aspects of the intentional production of ignorance that you feel deserve more scholarly attention? So where should we go with this? Finally, on agnotology, I was wondering, I was also expecting a little bit more on the position or the role of knowledge in the struggle against urban injustice. So what does that imply, agnotology? Does that imply that we do not act in just ways because our knowledge of the urban world is wrong? And if our knowledge was right, would we just act in just ways? I'm sure it's not that simple, and I'm sure you would agree it's not that simple. But where exactly is agnotology and the role of knowledge or wrong knowledge or ignorance? Where is that important in the struggle for social justice? And who do you think, who exactly needs good evidence and more correct arguments to be able to act differently and in more just ways? So that's the first set of questions. Secondly, and maybe more briefly, I wanted to say some things on policy relevant research. I think there is no doubt that as social scientists, we need a degree of autonomy to set our own research agenda, to set our own research question. And there's also no doubt that increasingly external funding agencies try to impose an agenda. You can look at the European Commission, for example, who has very little funding channels through which people can bottom up set topics. Most of the topics are, however broad they are, they're still sort of imposed based on a kind of political agenda. And given the importance of European funding, of course, that really steers research. So there's no doubt that we should discuss the degree of autonomy which we have as social scientists. And I think there's no doubt as well that this space has been under threat. At the same time, very early on in its history, the social sciences became dependent on public and sometimes also private money. And there's been only a very short period in which social scientists were self-funded. Very early on, we decided to establish ourselves in public institutes, in universities, and that would be the privileged places from which we do social science. And it's difficult for me to imagine any other funding model that does not involve some kind of state funding, or actually quite a bit of state funding. And of course, money always comes with implicit or explicit conditions. But if you think about the post-war decades, the expansion of the social sciences very much occurred hand in hand with the expansion of the welfare state and the endless need for data and insights to develop social policies. Maybe we didn't notice or problematize the conditions under which we could do that kind of research as social scientists as much, maybe because many social scientists share the ethos and the mission of the welfare state, but did we have so much more autonomy at that time? So I think it's unlikely that the autonomy of social scientists will ever be absolute. We need money to do whatever we do. We need time to do so. So we need the money to come from somewhere. So I'm wondering whether we need whether we do have to look, I think, at autonomy as something relational, as something which is determined by the particular social institutional relationship that we build with non-academic organizations, amongst which, of course, in a very important role, the state, and the particular features of that relationship. Surely, if we would live in splendid isolation or ivory towers, I'm not entirely sure. I'm actually not convinced that we would be able to produce more socially relevant knowledge. It's very much my experience is that I think we need to understand the complexities of governing urban societies, which are very, very fragmented. And that means also harnessing the knowledge that is developed within institutions that govern society, and let the knowledge be challenged by that. So while I agree with your argument, I'm wondering what kind of relationship with the state are you envisioning, or are you envisioning that we can actually continue as social scientists without any relationship with the state or state funding? And I'm sure your argument, I haven't read your argument as a call to withdraw in our economic ivory tower, but I think the book lacks a bit of an attempt to specify, I think, the conditions under which urban scholars can engage critically, but also productively with state institutions. And I think I would want to hear a little bit more about what do you think are the conditions of possibility to engage with state institutions or other non-academic organization in a more productive and constructive way. And I think the position from which people are writing probably give people a different kind of view on that. And maybe finally, on neighborhood effects, I think, and that's well known, of course, the criticism which you have been developing in the past on neighborhood effects. I think they're very valid criticisms. So, I mean, the basic fundamental argument is really why do people end up in the neighborhoods which are badly serviced or stigmatized in the first place? So what's happening in the labor market, the housing market, that people find themselves in these neighborhoods is an absolutely crucial question, and one which is indeed very much sidelined in the neighborhoods effect debate. But I think when I'm reading the chapter, you seem so determined to kind of almost completely destroy the thesis of neighborhoods effects, and that it seems to me that on theoretical grounds, you foreclose any possibility that the neighborhood may matter at some point, even though I think everybody, or at least I would agree, that its effect is likely to be much smaller than the effect of the social position of people in society, class position, ethnic position, and so on. So what I wanted to say to finish off this comment on neighborhoods effects, I think there is a long tradition of neighborhood-based interventions, often referred to social innovation, which is a kind of a spin-off of the regulation approach. So it has a very explicit progressive intent. And it's not so much based on arguments about neighborhood effects. So there's very little reference in that debate on neighborhood-based interventions, on local social innovation to neighborhood effect. However, the idea there is that in some cities, in some neighborhoods in cities, because of deindustrialization, all kind of structural processes, there is very much the presence of multidimensional forms of poverty. And there is also the observation that national welfare regimes and their very sectoral policies do not adequately address this poverty. And so in this context, I would say that local social policies and neighborhood development strategies actually make a difference, and that there is quite a lot of literature on local social innovation, on neighborhood development that actually shows how it can make a difference, under what condition it can make a difference, precisely because they really start from process of social exclusions and how they are linked to each other, how bad housing, health problems, school performance are linked, and how they need to be addressed in an integrated way. For example, by having local healthcare center reframe health issues as housing problems and put it on the political agenda. So in that sense, I find it hard to see how neighborhood-based strategies cannot be effective as part of a multi-scalar set of social policies. So my question here is, and that's really the last sentence that I will say, is I still think after reading your neighborhood-based, your criticism of neighborhood effects, that we need a sort of a more multi-scalar understanding of how urban inequalities are produced. And it's surely important to look at macro level processes of capital accumulation and financialization, but surely there is also room for looking at how social exclusion also operates on a neighborhood scale, and how also interventions within a multi-scalar approach can actually make a difference. So thank you for writing this book. Thank you for allowing me this time to respond to it. And so I'm really looking forward to the further discussion and questions from the other people that are present. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Stijn, for your thorough discussion of the content and for the thought-provoking, I guess, questions also to Tom. And I don't know if, Tom, you would like to answer immediately, or would you like to collect some other issues from the audience first? We can do both. It has advantages and disadvantages, as you prefer.
Okay, I think there's a lot here, and I'm very grateful to Stijn here, because I mean, I can't possibly answer these in the depth that I want to in this context, and I hope this will be just the beginning of a conversation between us, Stijn. So first of all, thank you for your intellectual engagement and generosity, and for these really important things that you've picked out here. I'm not sure I have answers to all of them, but I'm going to have a go at answering a few of them anyway. And I think if I do that first, because then there'll just be too many questions and I've only got a small piece of paper. Your first set of questions was to do with agnotology, and you asked me, when is it agnotology and when is it simply academic disagreement? Is that a fair way of summarizing one of your questions? Yeah. I mean, this is a great question, but you use the example of my treatment of Neil Smith's rent gap theory to sort of say, well, what you're doing here is just showing where you think the theory is more important than perhaps other people do, right? Well, I think I'm actually trying to do a bit more with it, because that chapter is actually called Gentrification Beyond False Choice Urbanism. And I have lost count of how many times I have seen people write about gentrification in these very binary terms, which is effectively, I think, best summarized that gentrification is, we know it has some bad things, but it has to be better than, say, urban decay or urban decline. Surely we want that and not the other, right? And this is I think the mainstream argument that I see most often about gentrification, and it's actually being used by people who are, I suppose, trying to promote gentrification as well. That's a different set of concerns, but you see that argument used by people who are trying to defend this as the savior of cities and things. And the reason that I used quite a lot of space in that chapter to go into Neil Smith's rent gap theory was two reasons. The first reason was I felt that there were quite a lot of caricatures and misunderstandings still flying around about it. That's the first reason. But the second reason is I think the rent gap theory can help intervene and respond to what I see as that false choice agnotology, because what the rent gap theory explains, and it's anchored in a broader theory that Neil Smith had on uneven development, is that disinvestment and reinvestment are not sort of separate processes. They're very much intertwined, right? And they depend on each other. And the whole forced choice argument about gentrification being better than decay completely collapses if you have a really comprehensive understanding of rent gap theory, right? And if you really read the originals, right? So there's so many people who write about the rent gap theory based on reading what somebody else has said about it, without actually going into a lot of the detail of Neil Smith's early writings, which I think are still not read in the depth that I'd like people to read them in, because not only are they brilliantly written, but I think they're incredibly convincing in terms of trying to explain how this process unfolds and where our lenses should be if we're trying to understand the political economy of this process. So I think I don't think that what I'm trying to do with agnotology is simply disagree with what others have said. I'm trying to use it to respond to, I think, what is an unhelpful framing of gentrification, right? So that's question one about agnotology. The second one, you said, well, where do we go with it? Like, where do we? So you were expecting me to talk about the production of ignorance in the conclusion to the book. Well, I think where we go with agnotology is quite simple, really, in that we need to be looking at who the producers of ignorance are, what institutions they work for, the techniques that they employ. And that actually goes, and that requires methodology, which is often tedious, right? Years and years ago, Jamie Peck wrote a nice piece called Grey Geography, right? And it was a short intervention in a journal, I can't remember which one, but he was saying that if you really want to have an institutional political economy approach, you have to do the tedious work of looking at think tank documents, of looking at policy documents, of looking at the ways that how certain debates or issues are framed. And you have to take this stuff as seriously as you would if you were doing a regression analysis, or if you're doing a survey, or if you're doing an ethnographic piece of research. So I think that sometimes we don't go into this stuff because we know what we're going to read, but it's important to see how these documents are composed and the kinds of disinformation that is circulated. The final question, I was a little confused actually, Stijn, about what you were trying to ask me with the third point of agnotology. I wonder if you'd just like to ask that again, because I think I scribbled something here because I was a bit confused. So I wonder if you could just ask the third part of that again.
Yeah, I was wondering how if you think about social struggles, which you argue what should very much be informed by what academics do, that we should be aligned with what the struggles of urban justice. And so you frame the whole book around agnotology. So that implies that you think that the production of urban knowledge is very crucial to that. And I think there's no disagreement there. But how exactly do you see this? Have we done enough if we take away the production of ignorance? Right. Do people not do what we hope they would do? Do they not do the right things because they have the wrong knowledge? Would they act in a different way if they would have the correct theory of gentrification? Would they still say, well, I know I have the correct theory, but I still act differently according to different interests or different preferences?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'll give an example. So one of the things which I've found really rewarding in the last sort of 5-6 years or so is that I've had a lot of conversations with this tenant movement, well, now a tenant union that I mentioned earlier in Scotland called Living Rent, right? And this is a movement that's calling for tenants' rights more broadly, but rent control has been one of its main organizing strategies, okay? So calling for tighter regulation of the private rented sector in Scotland. And one of the things which I found, I mean, I've learned a lot from what they've been doing, but also I found that it's been useful, I think, for them to have a more coherent idea as to what kind of arguments to expect when they go into certain policy or government circles or debates with people who would take issue with what they're trying to do, right? So in terms of the, like, how do we take up agnotology and, you know, how can it be useful? Right. And I think that it can be useful because if you have a clearer idea as to what somebody's going to say when you put forward a strategy or if a campaign or a set of proposals or a set of demands even, or the Cryan demand, right, if we're talking of Lefebvre, I think it's useful to know what the response might be so you can be prepared for it. And so I think there is a role for scholarship there to identify some of the threads that you see across contexts in when there are certain arguments put forward or there are certain responses that you might get. On to your second issue on the question of policy research and state funding and the question of autonomy and the relationship with the state. And I mean, this early on in the book in chapter 1, for those of you who've not seen the book, what I try and do is I try and identify what I see as the growing heteronomy of urban research. And what I mean by that is that certainly in the 20 years that I've been working in universities, I have noted that it's become more difficult. I mean, I'm talking, obviously I've only worked in the UK, but it's become more and more difficult to ask your own questions and to carve a completely autonomous research agenda, or what you might call blue skies research, right? Where you ask the questions and that come from years of research and you build your own agenda, right? Because there are always sort of funding themes and funding priorities, and that requires you to put your work in a certain kind of register. And you asked me, well, you know, what are the conditions of possibility to engage with state institutions, and what do we do about this problem of heteronomy, and how do we become more, how do we get greater autonomy? Because there is this sort of tug of war, as I call it in the book, between heteronomy and autonomy. And I think this is really a case of, well, we need to ask what kind of knowledge is valued, right? And I think that what I have seen, certainly when I've tried to, usually unsuccessfully, apply for research funding, what I've noticed is that the kinds of work that I do and the kinds of people whose voices I think are important to listen to and to learn from tend not to be appreciated by, I suppose, state institutions and funding bodies, right? So I'll give you an example. So a few years ago, I was unsuccessful yet again in applying for funding to do some research on the housing crisis in Scotland. I won't go into details on the proposal, but I wanted to do this in partnership with grassroots organizations and tenant movements. And it was very clear to me, looking at what proposals did get funded under the scheme, that those voices were not important, because the kind of work that received the funding was statistical work. It was survey work. It was work that engaged at a sort of macroeconomic level. It was not work that engaged at ground level, as I call it. And so I think, what are the conditions of possibility? Well, this is, I think, a responsibility that I think researchers and people sitting on funding award panels have, is to think about what kinds of, you know, like a multiplicity of voices, right? And I don't see this happening. And how do we intervene in this? Well, it's a case of just saying it, right? Because I don't think we talk about these things enough, because you have, you know, the kinds of work that gets funded, certainly in what I do research on, tends to be, it tends to be quantitative. It tends to be, and I'm not saying that quantitative research is bad, but I'm just saying that the work where you engage with social movements and engage with grassroots struggles, it's very unusual to see that work get the funding. And we need to talk about this more, because we don't talk about it enough. Your final point about neighborhoods and neighborhood effects. Well, neighborhoods do matter, I'm going to say, right? And I think I do say that at some point in the book, but I also say that they don't matter as much as we think. And in the neighborhood effects circles, there seems to be a problem, and I call this tautological urbanism. It's a little bit provocative, but what I tend to see is that there's people who do research on neighborhood effects who they write articles that say that, well, there might be neighborhood effects. There's fairly weak evidence in this context, stronger evidence somewhere else, but we need more funding and more research to find out if they exist, right? And this just keeps on happening, right? It's been happening for a very long time, where more and more people just are applying for funding to tell us the same thing, which is that, well, there might be neighborhood effects there might be a stronger evidence there, but not here. And I think, well, where's this really going, this kind of work? And when you talked about local social innovation, you talked about, you know, neighborhood-based policies, often from the ground up, and you talked about, you know, the facts that there are interesting things and important things happening at the neighborhood scale, which are just as important as the scaling up, right? And I agree with you, but what we don't see in, I suppose, the neighborhood effects canon, at least the work that I've looked at, is that you don't see people talk about political solidarity and grassroots struggles as neighborhood effects, right? You don't see campaigns for rent control as a neighborhood effect, right? And I think these are the neighborhood effects that we might want to look at. And neighborhood councils and tenant movements and environmental justice struggles. And, you know, there's so many things that happen at the neighborhood scale, which often are born through people living in a shared space and a shared struggle, often if it's a poor neighborhood. And you don't see this as part of the neighborhood effects discussion. And I think there's a reason for that, because, you know, that's not where the priorities are, right? And I think it's important to show that there are different kinds of neighborhood processes. But when we talk about neighborhood effects, we don't talk about, like you've just said, local social innovation. So I agree with you that we should be. I hope I've responded to your points well, but I would need longer to be more coherent and more articulate about some of these things that you raised. But I'm hugely grateful for the engagement, Stijn. Thank you.
Thank you for the response.
Wonderful. I think we had already a set of very interesting arguments on the table. I would like to ask the people from the audience to have comments or questions to be raised and discussed with Tom and Stijn and all the others participating. So please, now it's the time to raise your hand. While you are, okay, we have one. Wonderful. Ollie Mold, please, the floor is yours. Maybe you can shortly present yourself or say where you are coming from, just to locate you in the...
Yeah, hi, I'm Ollie. I'm a geographer at Royal Holloway University. I'm fortunate enough to know Tom, and hi Tom, thank you for such a wonderful talk. My question, with regard to agnotology, I mean, this might be going off on a tangent, so I apologise and feel free to reel me back in, but it's always been something which I've been, because obviously I know in relation to your work, and whenever I kind of come across the think tanks, and it always makes me think of what you say. But when you hear people sort of, you know, I guess my point is about like, when does it sort of bleed over into conspiracy theory? Because people who are belligerently believe something, like flat earthers, for example, are they being agnotological? Whereas, you know, people like that, we don't claim they have a hidden agenda, we just claim they're stupid. But there's a sense that they are obviously still purporting a sense of ignorance into the world. And the same with climate denial. And although I guess with climate denial, there's a sort of hidden economic agenda behind it. So when does it stop? Is it just purely about hidden agendas? And can you draw a line between something that is producing agnotology, i.e. a deliberate smokescreen to hide a hidden agenda, and something that is purely just sort of ignorance for the sake of ignorance? Do you see what I mean? I don't get the difference. Can you just somehow elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, thanks, Ollie. I'll do my best. Lindsay McGooey has an interesting phrase in her book that I mentioned on the unknowers. She says that there are different kinds of ignorance, and agnotology doesn't have a monopoly on ignorance studies. So there is actually a broader field, by the way. There's even a Routledge book series in ignorance studies. So I will say that agnotology is not the only way of thinking about the production of ignorance, right? There are different kinds of ignorance, and I won't go into detail on different ways. And I mean, Lindsay McGooey's concept is strategic ignorance, which she argues is a little different from agnotology, because where agnotology becomes interesting is because it really matters in terms of questions of power, right? So you can have somebody, as you say, on Twitter, who can say we have a flat earth or climate change is a myth and all this kind of thing, right? And that can just be somebody voicing an opinion on social media. They might get lots of retweets, they might find people engaging with it. But where I think agnotology is important, and where I think Robert Proctor, why he came up with this term and why he wrote about the mythology around that's produced by the tobacco industry, is because the decisions which are taken based on the production of ignorance have major consequences in people's lives. Okay, and I think if we think about the housing problem that we have in the UK and probably every country where people are tuning into this call, right? The decisions which are taken at the highest level, it will be, you would probably find ignorance floating around that people know is not the case, but because there's an agenda there, right? Because there is an ideological agenda, there are various techniques and strategies that people deploy in order to make us look in a different direction. Okay, and I think that's where it's different from a conspiracy theory, because we're talking about who has the power to determine what happens to people and how do they go about doing that. And I think that's where agnotology becomes a little different from, say, a bog standard conspiracy theory, because it's about what questions are on the table and what strategies are deployed to stop other questions arriving at that table, right? And that requires a level of skill and training, and not just a real belief in something, but which they do have, the people who are producing ignorance, but I suppose an institutional apparatus that allows that belief to take shape. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah.
So maybe this goes very much in the direction of Cambridge Analytica in political election and manipulation of data, probably, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
But okay, next questions or comments? If you are thinking about asking a question, okay, yes, Nick, please, the floor is yours.
Hi there, sorry, just turning my camera on. So I'm Nick, I'm a city planning student at Glasgow Uni and a member of Living Rent involved here in Partick. So very much appreciate your work, Tom. I just wanted to, well, the question just covered something that I was going to ask, but I wanted to rake your mind a bit, Tom, on the changing agenda in Scotland at the moment, obviously with Homes to 2040. And something I've personally been reading at is this kind of, this connection between Scotland and other countries and the we all kind of grouping of countries that seems to be more of a kind of a rhetoric of welfarism that's coming back into a lot of Northern European countries. And I was, relating this to the kind of agnotology argument. I thought it was interesting to see what you have to say in that regard, and how, for example, as you say, groups like Living Rent can use these kind of, penetrate these documents with this thesis.
Nick, I wonder if you would just mind going into a bit more detail for us about the things you mentioned. This, I actually couldn't catch the first thing you said. You said Homes for 2040, was that right?
That's right, yeah. So
you just summarize that for us briefly.
Yeah, so the Homes to 2040 is a new policy document that's in the last stages of consultation in Scotland. Living Rent has had a good input on it, especially with the new kind of New Deal for tenants, and this idea of rent control is being brought back into the political agenda in Scotland. one of the main things, obviously, for us, as you know, and just to give background to other people, is the whole idea of rent pressure zones in Scotland, and that's something that's getting brought into this new long-term. I think it's the first long-term housing agenda in Scotland. Obviously, going in line with a lot of other policy making that is looking into the future for good reason. So that's the main kind of consideration that I'm coming from.
Okay. I have a few responses in terms of what's been going on. One of the things I've noticed is that the current Scottish government likes to put fairly arbitrary timeframes on things, right? So, I mean, homes for 2040 being one of them, like why 2040? And the other thing is when they brought in rent pressure zones, they even announced, I think they used the term, they actually say that we're going to bring in rent control, or was it just rent pressure zones was what they said? Can you remind me, Nick?
I think it was just rent pressure zones. So
rent pressure zones. I mean, the other thing is they said we're going to regulate the private rented sector, and they were talking in very progressive terms about affordable housing and the importance of protecting communities so there's no sort of string of eviction and everything. But then they said, we will do this in 5 years' time. And so there seems to be this kicking the can down the road. And I find that this is a particularly fascinating development that's happened certainly in the last 10 years in Scotland, where certain dates are given, certain timeframes, but then I think this is a way of just delaying things because they're not quite sure how to implement them, or maybe they don't want to implement them. The other thing I'll say is that in the Scottish context, we have a serious problem of people who in high levels of Scottish government are landlords. So we have a lot of people who are, in a way, their vested interests in the housing market are under threat because of the organising that people like Living Rent and organisations like Living Rent have been doing. So it's been remarkable to watch how rent control is on the agenda, but it's been fascinating to see how there's always attempts to sort of water it down rather than actually say, well, this is what's going to happen and it's going to happen now. And I imagine that this is because of all the competing interests that you find when any policy gets announced, and that you've got the sort of landlord lobby groups and the various real estate groups who are trying to intervene and sort of steer things in a different direction. So, but to be honest, Nick, these are the kinds of things that you know anyway, far more than I do. But I think the interesting thing in terms of agnotology would be to look at why is it that certain timeframes are put forward. You know, nobody can ever, like, why 5 years' time? Why 2040? Why we'll do this in 10 years? And, you know, nobody seems to be able to give a coherent answer when you ask a politician that question.
Thanks very much for your response, Tom.
Well, thank you. Any other question? I have also a question while we are waiting, eventually, but let me see if there are other people coming forward. No, so I will ask my question now. I enjoyed very much your talk and also the book. I was wondering how you deal analytically with difference. You were quoting Sonia Bachi's book. You were making examples from different countries, hinting also to Berlin, to the UK, to other cases in your book. And I was wondering how you use the existing differences to locate them in your analytical framework, how you justify that. It's a different, like Stein's comment, well, Stein is coming from a country where the state plays a different role, acts differently, provides people with different rights, also on the housing market, protects against evictions, puts in place processes which make gentrification slower, taking more time eventually, and protecting some people from being dislocated or displaced. So I was wondering how you deal with these differences. Is this a mainstream neoliberalization? Are there different speeds? Are there different depths or magnitudes of this process in extreme cases like the US and the UK, of course, and others? So I was wondering, at a more abstract level, going back to the concepts, we know about the variegated neoliberalism approach, and the fact there is a mainstream, but there are many differences actually, like capitalism. Capitalism in Japan is different from capitalism in Italy or in the UK or Germany or Austria, even Austria. Austria, just to give you on the housing market, we have just finished a book on Vienna, and so the market regulates 11% of housing stock in Vienna. 11%. 19% it's home ownership, but 43% it's social housing, and 22% is private regulated market. So the share of control is extremely high. And the impact it has is that only 18% of the Viennese population pays more than 40% of their income on housing. In London, is it 62% compared to 18%. So it's more than 3 times that figure. And here, of course, there is something we need to understand and to explain. So the role of the state, the role of regulation, the role of the legacy of history. You mentioned also that in your talk. It's very important, and how things change over time. The legacy of Red Vienna, of course, is important. But how you deal with these differences? That was, in a nutshell, the question.
It's a wonderful question. One of the things that was probably the hardest thing to write in this book was to try and make a coherent argument across several different case studies, because this is anyone who's ever undertaken comparative research knows that this isn't easy, right? Because of the difference issue, right? And so in the book, I have examples from, I think I've got one from Vancouver, I have a couple from Cape Town, I've got one from Glasgow, a couple from one from Santiago, Chile. You know, there's several examples flowing through this book, and I think there's a chapter where I talk about the concept of the ghetto and how it's understood. And I've got 3 different examples from 3 different contexts in Europe in that chapter. And I was thinking, as I was writing, I'm glad you asked this question, because I thought, oh God, this is going to be a really difficult thing to get past a lot of the current debates in urban studies, especially some of the interventions coming from scholars who work with, say, post-colonial theory, because I'm generalizing here about agnotology and symbolic power across these contexts. And how appropriate is that, given some of the differences that you've just articulated in your question, like between, say, Vienna and London, right? So how do you do that? Well, I tried to be cautious, but I also tried to be clear that across these contexts, there were some similarities that seemed to be quite important to articulate. And some of those similarities were with the exercise of symbolic power, in that there are various institutions, policy elites, think tanks, philanthropic foundations, in the case of the Rockefeller Center imposing a resilience agenda on Cape Town, for example, where it became impossible to ignore some of the common threads between these places. And the same with the production of ignorance, right? And I felt that based on what I know and what I discovered doing research in these places, there were some things that were strikingly similar. And I felt that it was important to mention that, but also to acknowledge that there are radically different histories behind these places. So in the chapter on neighborhood effects, for example, I give the example of a neighborhood in Cape Town that was destroyed under apartheid, and what happened to people who were evicted and where they were displaced to, and how their lives changed so dramatically in that different context. And an external observer might, you know, if you don't spend time in that context and you don't understand it, you would think, well, it must be the neighborhood that's shaping how somebody's life is so different. But actually you think, well, why has somebody been moved to a different place? And that was a process of racial domination and state violence. And so I felt that there were some similarities across these contexts that were necessary to articulate, whilst not denying the question of difference. So to deal analytically with difference, I think comes, I suppose, cautiously, but also with a view that, you know, difference is we can't ignore them, but at the same time, we can't ignore differences. When we're looking at differences, we can't ignore what's similar, which is an age-old debate in urban studies anyway. That leads me to something I did want to say in my talk, but I ran out of time. One of the things which I find quite frustrating, which I've written about at the end of the book, in critical urban studies in the last few years, there have been some really quite heated debates between people who work with, say, a political economy approach and those who work with the sort of post-colonial approach to urban issues. I think we've seen this most recently in the journal Society and Space, and also International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. There was some quite barbed attacks on planetary urbanization that came from several writers. And they had some important things to say, and I don't deny that. But I also found some of these interventions quite frustrating, because we're talking about a group of scholars who tend to agree, I think, politically, right? Who tend to share the same social justice approach to understanding cities and who want to make better cities for a better world. Ultimately, that's why we're all here. But I find some of these debates extremely frustrating, frustrating because we tend to lose sight of what's at stake here. And if you have people on the left who are always debating theoretically in quite heated ways and arguing, and I just find, well, who's winning here? That's where ignorance production then picks up steam. And that's why I felt it was necessary to deal with difference with a generalizing concept of symbolic power and agnotology, to show what's happening while the left is engaged in this, oh, my critical approach is better than yours. And, and I felt that that's what I tried to do at the end of the book. And I don't claim to impose an agenda on urban studies. And I don't want people to think that I wrote this book because I want everybody to do research using agnotology and symbolic power. But I felt it was important to show the kinds of things which are happening, which are accelerating, and what we might lose sight of if we get too immersed in these theoretical struggles, rather than in the struggles happening at, for affordable housing in so many places.
Thank you, Tom. Indeed, that's quite an important issue indeed. Yes. Any other question in the meantime, which might have emerged? Or Stijn, if you want to react to some of the issues you have heard in the meantime, or some of the students.
The other thing, it could very well be that most people listening to this call have not read the book, and basically, if you suddenly think of a question which you want to ask me after the call, you'd rather not ask it now, then please write to me. I'd be very happy to engage. Also, if you read the book at a later date and want to ask me questions, and however critical your responses are, that's why I'm here. That's why I like learning from. We learn where people disagree, right? And that's wonderful for me to listen to where there's problems with my analysis, and that's how we sharpen the analysis in the future, right? So I'd be very happy to listen at a future date, if not now.
I had just one example of an excursion we had this summer in Aalborg in Denmark. Mm-hmm. We were in a project with some geographers actually as well. And it was about territorial cohesion. And the local organizer brought us to see some social housing neighborhoods and show that it was very problematic, and how we could find solutions to this, and the people experienced that in a harsh way. Mm. And I showed pictures of these neighborhoods to my students, and they were, that's middle-class neighborhoods. So it was not social, it appeared not to be social housing. They thought, no, here it's impossible social housing, because they had a different image in mind of social housing. And that's Europe. So the differences between Aalborg, Italy, Vienna, or maybe other places.
Yes.
So indeed, one of these elements which I think, so you rightly underline this issue of there are some common elements indeed. Yeah. And I fully support that view. At the same time, in relation to what makes a difference, indeed, the Polanyian approach of having commodification and decommodification forces and this double movement going back and forth, somehow in our work with Stijn about social innovation, that provided us with a lens of reading differences and how much of a process of exposing people, or you mentioned the concerned communities, the vulnerable ones. And indeed, while in the 70s and 80s, the state was an object of attack, I remember an LC21 conference I've organized in Urbino in 2015, where David Harvey, in his plenary keynote, said, yes, we criticized the state a few decades ago, but now we are concerned that the state is disappearing, because that was somehow protecting the more vulnerables at some point. And if the state disappears, it becomes more difficult to protect them. And so just as a side note to the whole thing.
I always find, sorry, carry on, Stijn.
Yeah, maybe just to add on to that, because maybe just to push a little bit on the question on your relationship to state institution, because it left me unclear at the end of the book whether you see, maybe just think about the state in the UK or any local state you're involved in Edinburgh. Do you see any possibility for a productive engagement with the state in the UK, with the local state, and or a corner of that state? Because of course it's not a homogeneous block. Maybe not the national government and the local state, maybe not elected politicians, but then opposition politicians or functionaries, maybe not the state in itself, but sort of institutions, public institutions, which are a little bit functioning at a distance of elected officials. So do you see any possibility for a productive engagement with the state in the UK, with a local or national, or do you think that's a lot needs to change for this to be?
It's I think this is dealing analytically with difference, right? The UK is too broad here because I'm in Scotland, and in Scotland there are very diverse, municipalities, let alone Scotland being different from England. Okay, so you have. And also the role of the state in society is so multi-sided. So, this is the Bourdieusian left hand and right hand as well. So do I see possibilities? Yes, of course I do. And I do see possibilities where you have sort of progressive coalitions forming among people who perhaps otherwise would not be in dialogue. So it's quite interesting for me, and maybe the guy who's from Living Rent who asked the question earlier would be able to tell us more, but Living Rent has managed to bring people together from different branches of politics in ways which I didn't think was possible in Scotland. Okay, so you have people who've come together around the housing problem, right? And we're talking about labor unions and now working with tenant movements, and that wasn't something that was a feature of the landscape, at least not that I was aware of, at least explicitly in Scotland for a long time. So that's a progressive thing here, right? So there is a possibility there. In Northern England, there are possibilities. The further south you go in England, I have to say that I don't feel optimistic at the moment. You just look at an electoral map, and then maybe leave aside London, that's a different, but it's depressing, right? So I don't really see a possibility for engaging with the state as a scholar in ways which are progressive at the moment. Not to say that'll always be the case, but it's bleak in my view. So Scotland's a different, the UK is perhaps, and I've probably been guilty in this presentation of talking about the UK, but there's huge differences in possibilities for engaging with the state.
But then the state is the condensation of social relationship on a specific territory. So if you say the more south you go, the electoral map, that's not just the state, that's also people having a specific position. So in fact, I don't think it's just the fact that we find it difficult to engage more productively with the state. It's I think as well that we find it difficult to engage productively with large segments of the population to convince them that we need to think otherwise about cities. Because the states least couldn't do what they're doing if there wasn't any kind of electoral base, or at least some kind of base in the population that would follow them, that would not speak against that. So maybe there's a broader problem about how critical urban scholarship relates to organized society.
Indeed, this seems to me a very fruitful perspective, in the sense that the narratives that these think tanks you were referring to, Tom, influence the kind of legitimacy people see in policies developed by the state. So the state puts in place instruments that can be used in either way. So, and probably here is the link. Some places policies are indeed making a big difference. In other places, policies are cut off, and that's actually quite.
Well, on this question of the state, the interesting thing about the think tanks is that these are non-state institutions that have state effects, right? So you have this quite remarkable network, remarkable in its power, of organizations that not only talk to each other, but who, because they are registered as charities, they are legally, they don't have to disclose who's funding them, right? So they can keep, that's another level of ignorance production in itself. But the other thing is these organizations are connected to think tanks elsewhere, right? So you have think tank officials going to the United States or in conversation with things that are happening, say in Chicago or New York or Washington, and then getting ideas. There's all kinds of policy transfer that happens that isn't among state institutions, right? But these are among institutions that have very, very strong state effects. So the question also is then, how do we conceptualize think tanks within a broader apparatus of the state, right? And that complicates the question of what are the possibilities for engaging with the state that you asked earlier. So and this is why it surprises me perhaps that there's not more research on these think tanks. But again, this is difficult work to do, not only because you have to read the grey literature, but because if you want to talk to people in think tanks, good luck. I tried, and they don't want to talk.
Okay, so if there are no other questions, I think we can all together thank Tom and also Stijn for discussing, and all of you for attending. The next meeting and book discussion will be with John Forrester, and it will take place on May. I don't remember the exact date, but Paul can find out, and you can find out the link of a platform, which is an interdisciplinary research platform on the challenges of urban futures. And I think your book, Tom, fits very well into that.
Well, thank you, Yuri, for this invitation, and thank you, Paul, for setting up the technology, and to Stijn especially for that really fantastic engagement. And thank you for anyone else who tuned in. And like I said, please write if you have questions you wanted to ask but didn't, and if you read the book in the future and want to engage, I'm very happy to listen.
Wonderful. Thanks again, and keep in touch for the future. And
absolutely.
Bye to everybody, and
appreciate it.
see you next time.